All right. Well, good morning. My name is Zach Braxton. I'm a member here of First Baptist Church Lincoln. This is a council of the American Baptist Churches of Nebraska here in Lincoln, Nebraska. And we'll start with introductions with the pastors.
My name is Pastor Steve Wistoff. I'm from Second Baptist Church here in Lincoln.
My name is Joy Martinez Marshall, and I'm the pastor of First Baptist Church Lincoln.
My name is Mike Kidder, and I'm the pastor at Belmont Baptist Church here in Lincoln.
So this morning, what we're going to do is look at John chapter 11, verse 1 through 45. And we're going to have a discussion about that scripture with the pastors. And we'll start with reading here, beginning at verse 1. And I just thought about this. Does anybody have a New International Version that I can? Because mine is King James. I don't think anybody. I just thought about that, just to make it more uniform. Now a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, "Lord, the one you love is sick." When he had heard this, Jesus said, "This sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it." Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he had heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. And then he said to his disciples, "Let us go back to Judea." "But Rabbi," they said, "a short while ago the Jews there tried to stone you, and yet you are going back?" Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours of daylight? Anyone who walks in the daytime will not stumble, for they see by this world's light. It is when a person walks at night that they stumble, for they have no light." After he had said this, he went on to tell them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I'm going there to wake him up." His disciples replied, "Lord, if he sleeps, he will get better." Jesus had been speaking of his death, but his disciples thought he meant natural sleep. So then he told them plainly, "Lazarus is dead, and for your sake I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him." Then Thomas, also known as Didymus, said to the rest of the disciples, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. "Lord," Martha said to Jesus, "if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha answered, "I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this?" "Yes, Lord," she replied. "I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who has come into the world." After she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. "The teacher is here," she said, "and is asking for you." When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still in the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who had been with Mary in the house, comforting her, noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. "Take away the stone," he said. "But Lord," said Martha, the sister of the dead man, "by this time there is a bad odor, for it has been there 4 days." Then Jesus said, "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." One more. Therefore, many of the Jews who had come to visit Mary had seen what Jesus did, believed in him.
Thank you.
So now we will start with questions, and one of the first questions that came up was the context in which this is being depicted here in Scripture, and so we'll start with Pastor Mike.
When I read this passage, I had to back up to the tail end of chapter 10 to get a picture, and with the help of a map in my study Bible, understand where Jesus was and why it took so long, that it took 4 days, and how did the messages get sent. I had to assume there's some kind of a runner, but it suggested in my notes that Perea, which is just northeast of Bethany and east of Jerusalem, and not all that many miles away, was probably where Jesus was, though other thoughts are that he was further up the Jordan. And at any rate, he was where John the Baptist had been baptizing, as it says, in the early days. And so in that context, I worked out a bit of a timeline, which we can talk about later. But it seemed important that Jesus was at the place where he started, where his ministry was started, when John the Baptist said, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." And so Jesus goes there, and he is near the end of his earthly ministry. Soon he'll be starting on his trek to Jerusalem, and to go there to die, to finish his work on earth. And it just seems significant that he came back to the place where it started with John the Baptist.
And to add to that, I know in my research, if you've ever studied any of Raymond Brown, he breaks up the Gospel according to John, in the book of the signs and the book of glory. And it seems as you said, Jesus is back to this place where it all began, is that this raising of Lazarus is kind of the camel, or the straw that breaks the camel's back in the eyes of the Jewish leaders there, but also it's a foreshadowing of the resurrection of Jesus, right? Jesus shows that the Father has given him power over death and conquering the grave, and that you're right, it's now coming all full circle as we lead up to see what the glory of Jesus is about and the conquering of death. And I think it's interesting that even geographically it's coming back together for us to see it now as Jesus will journey to Jerusalem in the later chapters.
You had asked about context. I think there's a spiritual context to this too that really stands out to me, because this is not Jesus' first encounter with this family. And so I think if there's a spiritual context, it's friendship, because one of the things we always draw from this passage is a close friendship and relationship between Jesus and these three siblings. It started before, probably back when Jesus visited their home under much better circumstances than he's visiting right now. And so as I see context, I see it modeled for us that as we celebrate the koinonia, the fellowship of the church, that it should look something like this, and it should have this kind of compassion where Jesus wept. It should have the kind of a love where the women came out to Jesus and greeted him, and what his tone of voice is, we can talk about that later. I have no idea what it meant, but we have this context of friendship, and yet that's not the entire point of the story. The point of the story is much different than the context. I think the point is more the resurrection than it is but context, I think, reminds us of the context that the church is today, ought to be today.
Well, the first question, second question is, what is the background of this text?
Well, we kind of talked about it, didn't we?
Kind of touched on that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The background.
Well, and even more so, you know, where it says in the parentheses of the text that this is the same Mary that washed Jesus' feet or anointed his feet with the expensive perfume and wiped it with her hair, because she was showing her gratitude and love for Jesus for what he had done for her.
Yes.
And obviously, this whole family was changed through this,
Right.
and Jesus became close friends with him.
Yeah. And his friendship seems to be different with this family than he had other friendships, like his disciples, and that was more of a mentoring, discipleship kind of relationship. Whereas this, he came into fellowship with them. He had dinner with them. This was his family in a sense. Although he did have his natural family, but nevertheless, this had just a different tone to it than his other relationships.
Yeah, in the other Gospels, he visits Bethany regularly. Like you said,
Yeah.
this is a particular relationship. And some scholars even say, you know, they thought that this was his home away from home, that this is where he went to hang out, because he did have that deep relationship
Like
with Mary and
Yeah,
Martha.
a chosen family. or
Yeah,
something.
yeah.
Yeah.
Family by choice. I like
Yeah.
that.
hmm
Okay. So,
How do you think the disciples felt as they found out Lazarus had died, but they were still going to go to him?
I wrote this
like
question.
Jesus, yeah,
um,
Jesus is crazy.
Yeah, well, I just always think about, as a disciple, I always try to put myself in the disciples' shoes, and the fact that they're missing this whole point. You know, they're like, if he's asleep, what's the point? You know, Jesus.
He's gonna get better.
Yeah, and why are you freaking out? And why would you go somewhere where you are going to be stoned, where we think that we will die? And so I kind of played off of them finding out Lazarus is dead and just being like, so why are we going? And their kind of confusion. And when we think about our own journeys with Christ, you know, when God calls us to something, I don't know about you guys, but often I'm like, why? Why would we do this? What's the point? And then Thomas, here in verse 16, he said to the fellow disciples, let us also go that we may die with him, with Jesus. Thinking that they're facing the death, and this call to follow Christ, you know, to live as Christ, to die as gain. This whole idea that they're following up and going, but the fear and the confusion that there must have been in them as they walked along, as they journeyed back, knowing, well, okay, Lazarus is dead. Jesus, we might die. And I don't know, that always just bothers me in a good way, because it challenges me to think about my own faith and how I follow Jesus and how we encourage others to.
I don't know why the disciples didn't give up trying to manage Jesus. Because every time they tried,
They got it wrong.
he reprimanded them when he said, "Get behind me, Satan." You know, they tried to manage him, and you know, when he said, "Suffer the children to come unto me," they tried to manage them. Don't pay attention to those kids. And here they're saying, "We need to get back there and heal Lazarus. We should get going here." And they're always trying to, and Jesus always had a little bit different plan. He went on his own agenda, and that stood out to me. I don't know why it did, but it just stood out to me that they're always sort of trying to, and don't we try to do that too? Manage Jesus. We have our timeline, and Jesus, you know, God has his timeline, and we are always trying to superimpose our timeline onto God's, and then it never works. You know, it never works.
Trying to build off of that, they see the superficial. Like we do. We see what's going on in the world right now. We're all upset about the COVID thing, you know, and everybody's on edge about that. Myself too. So they're saying, Jesus, don't you understand? You're going to get stoned. Lazarus is already dead. Can't do nothing about him. Why are we going back to Jerusalem? You know, and so that's what they see. And Jesus, he knows what's going to happen and what this is for, and he states it clearly there in verse 14. Then he told him plainly, Lazarus is dead, and for your sake I am glad I was not there, because I would have healed him, right? Presumably, so that you may believe. But let us go to him. you may believe that he is the Christ, the Son of God, and he has power of resurrection and life. I think this is the implied meaning and the whole purpose of this whole thing of waiting the extra days until Lazarus is actually dead. So Jesus is trying to help them build their faith, because they are going to have a tough road ahead of them once he's gone.
And as pastors who are on social media, what do we say to people who are saying, God, we want this to end right now, this COVID-19 thing, we need this to end right now, Lord, do something about it. How do we respond to that with the same sentiment that Jesus responded to his disciples when they were wanting this to
challenge
happen?
Challenge for us, because we want to look with, at least I know I look with two human eyes, and yet we'd have to go back to what is that, verse 4, where Jesus said, this sickness will not end in death, and it didn't end in death, right? So he knows the end. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it. So that's the point. That's where he's at. So how do we look with those kind of eyes and help our people look with those kind of eyes too? That somehow out of all this sickness and death that's going on right now, the threat against our own lives, because we're older, at least you and I are, Steve. We're in that elevated risk category. How do we say somehow God is going to be glorified through this, and how do we keep our eyes open to that?
I think my challenge is always to think about, the idea that Jesus never asked for our certainty. Jesus never asked for our, 110% belief in all things every time. But he asks us to lean not on our own understanding, but to trust. And I think that a lot of it, and I know that this probably isn't super helpful, but I always chalk it up to the mystery of God. The idea that we do live in a broken and a fallen world that's hurting, but through that and in that, there's still new life. Jesus still brings about resurrection. And so I think that's the message I know, at least I try to say, is even if we have doubts or confusions or frustrations, to bring those before God, because God is big enough. You read the Psalms and Lamentations and all of these ways in which now we kind of read them like seems slightly disrespectful, but there is language, and you just reading those things and calling out, and in that searching, I think that there's a finding, there's a comfort that you get, even despite the uncertainty and the confusion.
So I hear two things, and it reflected in a verse here. I hear that we need to not be like the disciples were at this point. Of course, they were changed later, of being so certain that Jesus is not seeing the situation for what it really is. So trusting our own understanding is the mistake, right? And the thing we need to do is leave that open. This is what it looks like, Lord. But as Martha said, but I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. There's that mystery. If she doesn't understand it, but her brother's dead, and Jesus could have healed him if he'd got here sooner. But even now, that sense of the mystery that God is able to do anything.
And even the fact that it's a journey. The disciples didn't stay where they were at. They continued to move, and ultimately seemed to be thinking that they're going to face their own death, not even realizing that in that journey that they're actually going to see life, new life.
Transition into why did Jesus weep? What does this tell us about our own emotions?
I'm not sure exactly, I don't know what was going through Jesus' mind for sure. We can only assume that he was showing great empathy to them, and not just sympathy, but empathy, because I think this resurrection scene and the death scene of Lazarus was and I find it wonderfully ironic that we are in a season right now of Lent, and of the death and the resurrection. We're caught up in this international crisis right now where there is death, and also most of us are wondering, and we're quite certain at this point, that we won't even celebrate Easter in the normal way that we have
Mhm.
And we'll always remember this year as the year
Mhm.
that we didn't have Easter.
Mhm.
And yet Easter is every day.
Mhm.
And I think Jesus is reminding us there in that passage that, and I've already forgotten the question you asked
Oh.
because I'm getting off on something else, but
How did Jesus? Why did Jesus weep? Sorry.
why did Jesus weep? And the empathy that he was showing was this forerunner to, I think, to his own death and his own resurrection. So he was actually feeling the pain
Mhm.
and the agony of what's to come.
Yeah.
I mean, that's one interpretation of it, and maybe you've got other interpretations.
Or the pain and the agony that death causes to a human being.
Yeah,
Yeah, because maybe this is Jesus' human side
yeah.
coming
Yeah.
out, or at least, like you say, the empathy of the,
Yes.
the human side.
And in some of my research of reading some of the commentaries, they actually argued that this cry was a cry of anger and not compassion. That you're like you said, the agony of death. And one thing that they pointed out that I found was really interesting, Gail O'Day, she said that the tears are representation that Jesus acknowledges the pain that death causes, but also that the anger there, the tears and the anger, could be against the realm of death. This idea that
Yeah.
that the realm of Satan or Satan's work in the great enemy of death is what Jesus is crying out
Right.
against, and that whenever he comes up against that, and I think the same Greek word is actually used in the Garden of Gethsemane when he cries out in agony,
Yes.
and this understanding that it's you're bumping up with what's uncomfortable, and that is facing mortality as humans. You know, the last great enemy, death.
Right.
And in that, this crying out, you know, no angry tears, but sadness and darkness for the present world. This idea that it's
Yeah.
broken and it's
that
hurting.
it's broken and it faces death, but that's not the way it's meant to be.
Yeah, and that it's not the last word.
Yeah.
Because right after Jesus weeps, he says, "Where have you laid him?"
Mhm.
You know, or that might not be right after, but right before he weeps, and then the Jews say, "Oh, see how he loved him," and then Jesus says, "That's it. We're going to the tomb right now. You know,
Mhm.
this will not be the last word because I am the resurrection. I am the life."
Mhm.
It's easy for us to think in the beginning what we talked about with Jesus held back for a couple days up in
Korea or
what
whatever.
I believe is Galilee, that he was
Yeah.
up in that vicinity, but nevertheless it doesn't matter. But he held back for a couple days, and a lot of us will interpret that as apathy.
Mm-hmm.
And here, this dispels it. When he wept,
Mhm.
that
Yeah.
dispels any idea that he was feeling apathy before, because I mean he cared deeply for these women. You mentioned the word or the Garden of Gethsemane, and that's one of my favorite texts because I'm an old wrestler. I wrestled through high school and college, and you know the whole works. And I've been on the mat. And the word agon, the Greek word, actually comes out of the Greek games in the wrestling arena, where there was this. It means struggle. This struggle against two opponents who are force against force. And the agony that Jesus was feeling in the garden was force against force, and like what you suggested here
Yeah.
in this passage. So it almost it's appearing to me almost that this is a forerunner to much of what we see later on in the Passion passages.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Interesting.
All right, we'll move into why does it seem that people are in such a need for assurance and hope during this world crisis? In the same context, if you talk about talking about our own emotions, that's a nice transition into why does it seem that people are in such a need for assurance and hope during this world crisis?
Let everybody else jump in.
Yeah. Well, I think when I was thinking through this question, I recently read a book called "Everything Happens for a Reason and Other Lies I've Loved." And in that, it's this Duke professor that gets diagnosed with terminal illness, and she now writes a book sorting out all of her anger and pain and her faith, but how it all works out. And what people would say, right, is everything happens for a reason. And this idea that saying or that seeking for comfort is really kind of a way to guard yourself, to say, I'm so sorry that happened to you. I don't want it to happen to me. And I think it kind of goes back to this idea of mortality and seeing that, that we have bodies that often fail us. Some of us have pre-existing. Thank you, pre-existing conditions.
Yep.
Some of us are more susceptible. We see the pain that it's causing people, and we don't sit in the pain and the suffering. And as you said, Steve, it's ironic. This is Lent.
Yeah.
Lent is about embracing that. By dust you were created, and to dust you shall return. And I think that it's not an easy thing to do, and especially in the American church, I would argue that we've gone away from doing a lot of that because we hear Lazarus at funerals, right? We hear Lazarus when someone dies, and now it's kind of this idea that we are confronted with that. But the assurance that we have here is that Jesus says, no, I can bring about new life. It might not look how you think it should look, but in that, eternal life starts now. It doesn't start when you die. It starts when you start a relationship with Christ.
When you start to have confidence
Yeah.
in what happened here, as so we would face COVID saying, you know what, I might die from this, but this is not death. This, in the end, like Jesus said, well, go back to another.
But that's not the way most people are seeing it. Is it?
Yeah, I know. We're seeing it as
there's such, and I think the key word is fear.
Yeah.
And you mentioned anger and another word I can't remember. Anger and pain you mentioned, and I think a lot of those negative anger and emotional pain things that people feel are all about fear. And I think I'm going to go back and interpret, maybe wrongly. I'm going to try to interpret what these two sisters, both of them said the same thing to Jesus. They said, Lord, if you had been here, our brother would not have died. And I have to think that those were feelings of anger and almost a resentment. Lord, why weren't you here? And that's what comes out in people. People lash out in anger and because they're having this fear that they can't really identify. They can't wrap their minds around what's happening. And they're so filled with fear that it spills out in other ways that are really kind of ugly sometimes, honestly.
Yeah.
And that's I've always read that kind of as, why are they talking that way to Jesus? He's about to heal their brother. Well, he didn't know that.
They know that.
That's it. So, in this COVID fear, we're asking that same question. God, why aren't you here?
Right.
Why didn't you show up? And yet, God is here.
Right.
And that's
Absolutely.
the message that we have
That's
to try
the
to
message.
reinforce. God is here in the midst of all this, and we need to look with eyes other than the superficial, than listening to the news reports and hearing all the numbers and all that. But we need to trust that God is in the midst of all this, and that death is not the final thing that occurs. That's right.
And that the Spirit of God still moves even when we don't know it.
Yeah.
We're often we think we become selfish and say, well, I didn't see the Spirit move. I didn't see God in that. Well, that doesn't mean that the Spirit isn't moving, isn't working. And I think that's something important that we, need to continue to preach and teach, is that no, God is at work. God's in even this conversation of three churches getting together. That, if you don't know the history of it, we've had a lot of churches at different points, a lot of transfer over to the different churches. That's a part of the history of this town. But even coming together to show that we are working together, that we're on mission for Christ, even though we might pastor other churches in different areas, that doesn't mean that we can't work together. And you see that, as Mr. Rogers said, always look for the helpers, the nurses, the janitors, the truckers, all of these people that are really putting their life on the line to show that people are valued and important. I think that that's a testimony to the Spirit working.
Absolutely, and then every other thing that you sometimes hear on the news, sometimes don't, that people are taking it upon themselves to step up and help their neighbor or deliver groceries, whatever it is, just to show compassion and caring and use their abilities to serve in some way.
I should say that all of these questions that I'm reading are from the pastors themselves. So
we cheated a little bit. I'll have to say.
I would like to interject what Joy was saying, that we are three pastors working together. I'm a product of First. 13 years ago, I suggested by the pastor at the time to go try being a pastor at Belmont, and so it does. You know, we're all interconnected through God's word.
That's right.
Amen. Well, here is, we might have time for a couple more questions, I think. The first of the last here is, what message do we have for our friends and family that can bring peace and assurance?
Well, look to the end.
Yeah. I'm always one. I love history. I'm a history person. When I preach, history is part of my sermons, and I can't help that. And I apologize to those who don't like history, but that's what you're going to get.
Great, good stuff.
Because I think we learn so much from history. And I'm thinking, the other day I went for a walk. That's about all we can do. I've been staying home more this last week. And I walked over, we're just a few blocks from Wyuka Cemetery. And I told myself as I walked into the cemetery, I'm going to see how long it takes me to find an infant grave from 1918. It took me 15 minutes in that big cemetery to find a grave, because there's many. Because in 1918, they went through a crisis like this. And during that time, if you read what happened spiritually, there's a lot of different articles that are coming out from different sources right now. What happened spiritually during those times? And God really moved. And that was a much greater crisis, because they didn't have antibiotics, they didn't have,
ventilators.
They didn't have any of the stuff that we have today, any of the medical technology. They just patched you together and sent you home, and you went home and died pretty much. Or it had huge hospitals full of cots, and that's how people died. It's a different time, and yet in those times of crisis, God was present, and people understood that, and people grew through that. And so I kind of like to look back to history and say, how did God move then? God's going to move that way now, and God is moving that way now. So that's not the full answer, but it's so that's kind of where I come from.
Yeah, we've been through this before.
Yeah.
And God's present. Yeah, it's so often through some other things that happen through my other work. I've run into millennials who talk about being woke.
Yeah.
And it's like,
Are you woke?
No, if you say it, you're not. As a millennial.
Okay.
As a millennial, you can say
I'll
that.
speak
I
on
was
it.
discussing this with my mentor, Larry Ramsey, and we talked about, well, this all happened before. It was called the Enlightenment, or the Age of Enlightenment, all this, in the 1500s, and again in the late 1700s, and I believe, if I have my history right.
Yeah, that's right.
But it's
Late
like,
1700s.
what was the point of it all? Oh, humans have got it all figured out. Science is the answer, and we don't need God anymore. It's just the same thing over again, being promoted. And yet what has impressed me during pastor gatherings is the millennial pastors that are in that millennial age group, and yet they've come to faith. And they are the next wave of pastors that will take the place of us old guys, right?
Yeah, that's right.
So that's, faith is still possible.
Pastor Joy?
Can you repeat the question?
Oh, yes. What
Oh, wait.
message do we have for friends and family that can bring peace and assurance?
I definitely would say, looking at the end of the story, and just what really stood out to me as I read this again was Jesus's prayer, right? Jesus looked upward and said, "Father, I thank you for having heard me. I know that you always hear me, but I have said this for the sake of the crowd standing here, so that they may believe that you sent me." And then he calls out to Lazarus. And I think for me, the hope that I would offer is, in John we have all these I am statements. I am the way, I am the truth, I am the life, I'm the good shepherd, I'm the living water, and now I am the resurrection and the life. And that really resting in that, but trying in these hard times to look up and say, God, Father, I thank you for having heard me, because you do hear me. And this kind of refocusing of, we might not know what's going on, we might be worried, scared, and have fear, but at the same time we have to rest in the fact that God does hear us.
Yes.
And God meets us wherever we are. If we're self-quarantining, if we're here, if we're home, if we're ill, if we're working, God still meets us in those moments. And so I think it's those small, what I would offer is those small little practices of gratitude, which is
Yeah.
so challenging, but help to shift our mindset.
It does, and so that we might come to that same place,
Mhm.
that we might believe that Jesus is sent by God,
Mm-hmm.
right?
I think that's a good place to stop. We got about a minute, unless you guys have anything
Trust
else
God.
to expound on.
Yeah. I just think, I'll just say that this has really been fun. And we may be doing this for a while. If all of our congregations are in tune with this and they are okay with this, I think this is our new reality for a while. I hate to say it.
Yeah.
I enjoy saying it because this has been great, and I
Mhm.
think God's doing something here. But I'm afraid that church, as we've known it, is going to be on hold for a while.
Mhm.
And but nevertheless, we are still the church,
Mm-hmm.
and God is still at work. And I think that's what we've gotten out of our conversation today, is that
Mhm.
God is still at work in the world. So
Yeah, and this idea that though we're not meeting here in the building
yeah,
and we're not, we're canceling services. It's not canceling. It's learning to worship in a new way. And if this is how we're going to learn to worship in a new way, what an exciting time. What
Yes.
a time for us to truly testify to our hope in eternal life, our hope in a God that is near to us despite the uncertainty around us. And I think it's fun that we get to worship in a new way, and exciting that we get to bring our congregations along. And it is a challenge, but at the same time, growing pains are often the best ones.
Yeah, and can we mention Good Fridays?
Oh yeah.
Good Friday, which is on Friday.
Not this
Not
Friday.
this Friday.
Not this Friday, but next Friday, we will offer, as the three churches, drive up. What do we call it?
A drive-through Good Friday service.
Yeah.
Yeah,
How's
drive
that?
through. Yeah,
Drive through or drive by.
Drive up.
Drive by.
Yeah, drive
We've got drive-by shootings.
Yeah.
We've got drive-by blessings.
Yes.
Yeah, and it'll be held at Belmont Baptist Church,
Yeah.
as we have a large parking lot,
Mhm.
and you'll be able to drive up, have prayer. We'll figure out what it's going to be, but
Yeah.
it'll be
Yeah.
from noon to 3, and at 3424 North 14th Street
Yeah.
here in Lincoln.
Thanks for reminding us of that.
Yes.
More details to come on that.
That's right.
Well, thank you, pastors. It's been a blessing just being a part of this, and I hope you felt blessed at home. Remember that we are the church. The church building is just that, just a building. So God is on the move, and just pray that you and your family are safe during this time, and thank you for joining us, and God bless you.
Yes. And
Yeah.
thank you to Zach for being
Thank
our
you.
moderator.
Yes.
Make sure you wash your hands, practice social distancing, and continue
We're
to
trying.
support.
It's
Yeah.
hard to get everybody in the picture if we get too far apart.
Yes, and continue to love one another.